Oh, hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Diesen. This program is brought to you by the NGO Empowerment for Peace, which is based in Austria. My name is Josef Mühlbauer, I'm a scientific researcher at Empowerment for Peace and your host for today. Please make sure that you subscribe to our channel so that our peace community can grow. And now let me introduce to you Diesen. Diesen is a political scientist and professor of international relations at the University of South-Eastern Norway. His research interests are geoeconomics, geopolitics, Eurasian integration and Russian foreign policy. He wrote several scientific articles, appeared on many TV channels, podcasts and broadcasts, and he wrote the books The Decay of Western Civilization, Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, Greater Power Politics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and his latest book deals with the Ukraine crisis and is called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. And especially the term world order, we will elaborate in this interview. Glenn, I'm very proud and honored that you followed my invitation for this interview.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. So it's my pleasure.
Perfect. Let me begin with your latest book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Let us elaborate this term world order. We are observing several conflicts, several dynamics of escalation and geopolitical tensions. I'm referring to the new scramble for Africa, if we can call it like this, with the presence of France and the US, the old imperial powers, but also new players are coming with the Wagner groups and the Russia and China. I'm also referring to the tense US-China relations, not only because of the Taiwan question, but also because of the current trade wars that we are witnessing. And of course, I'm referring to the Ukraine conflict, which is, you called it a proxy war between NATO and Russia, as well as the tensions between Israel and Iran, which are escalating very quickly these days. Glenn, please help me out understanding what is going on and how can we analyze these conflicts. Are these events and conflicts, are they linked together? Can we observe some, let me say, two blocks, for example, geopolitical blocks, or are they separately from each other? And yeah, how can we understand it better? What is your take on that?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily explained by blocks. I think that's more of a good way of understanding the Cold War. But if you see the alternative to the West has a bloc through NATO, obviously, is an exclusive bloc in which country A and B, they compete for the collective advantage over state C. Now, you see this to some extent in terms of this alternative structures taking place. But what you see coming mostly from China, India, Russia, Iran, all of these countries is more of a counter-hegemonic system. So, and it's built on multipolarity, which is why it's attracting so many countries. So, for example, if this was simply a Chinese-led bloc, then you wouldn't be able to explain why, for example, India would be leaning very favorable towards it. No, they're leaning favorably towards multipolarity. And this is another issue because in a bloc system, you have to be either with us or with them. Whereas NATO likes to tell China, if you want to work with China, Russia, you can't do business with us. We do the same with the Indians and everyone else. It's us or them. Well, in a multipolar system, it has more flexibility. They effectively not pressuring anyone to choose between us or them, which is why this language, us or them, is very much restricted to our vocabulary in the West. So I think the best way of understanding the world order is the transition from the system we had after the Cold War, which was a system explicitly based on unipolarity, one which is preserved by the United States preventing any rivals from emerging. And this has now come to an end, and we have transitioned into a multipolar system. Now, when talking about multipolarity, it's both the international distribution and the legitimacy and the rules behind it. So it's a very drastically new system, and I would suggest the main conflicts we have today is the system is being pulled in two different directions. the collective West is trying to pull back to unipolarity by knocking out key adversaries, while the multipolar system seeks to have many centers of power. And this is why it's very difficult in the West to comprehend why are the Turks aligning with the Russians. Well, they're not supporting Russian hegemony. They're not pushing for Chinese hegemony. They're aligning more with the East, but also they want to do business with the West simply because they want to have multipolarity. So I think this is the best way to understand it. And I do think most of the conflicts we have today derives from this. I think Ukraine is obviously both a symptom, but also one exacerbating or intensifying this transition to multipolarity. But also the Middle East. Obviously, if the US hadn't given Israel an opportunity to do whatever it wants, it would have had to accept some compromise in which it takes into account the other side as well. And the same goes for China. The conflict derives largely from the US walking back the one China principle, and this is why it's preparing Taiwan, Philippines as well, new Ukraine's effectively proxies against the Chinese. So I think all of this is to prevent a multipolar system from emerging. And yeah, sorry if I go on, but that's kind of my last point. This is the problem with unipolarity. It's not a very good system. It can be sold as a good system, but it's not able to absorb a lot of changes in the international system. So when you have some changes in the international distribution of power, be it the rise of China, this can't be absorbed into a unipolar system, because by definition, the US wouldn't be a hegemon anymore if you have China rising. So it's very little ability to absorb new changes. And also that's why it reduces the West's ability to pursue a peaceful solution to conflicts. You might have realized or recognized that the go-to answer is always conflicts now. When we define peace, look at any Western newspaper. When do we ever talk about the legitimate security concern of other states, our rivals? We don't. We just explain why they're bad, and while we have great values, they have bad values. And peace is always achieved by either deterring, defeating, containing. This is how we deal with adversaries. So, and if we do have peace, it's usually temporary ceasefire while we prepare for a conflict, like we saw in the Ukraine crisis. So it's I think this is a good framework to understand what the world is going through now.
So the beginning of the liberal world order began with the Westphalian system after brutal war, and state systems emerged, and after that, and especially after the Second World War, with the Washington Consensus and many other Bretton Woods and so on and so forth, the liberal order become its shape as it's clear today. Is it simplistic to say it like this, or?
Well, I wouldn't say the liberal international order came with Westphalia, because Westphalia can be considered the modern world order, but this came in place in 1648 after the 30-year war, because before this you had a hegemonic distribution of power, and there was not sovereign equality for all entities, obviously. But after the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, then you have the Peace of Westphalia. It's based on many centers of power, many sovereign states, and they pursue peace based on a balance of power. Now, this has changed, of course, over time due to industrial revolution and changes occurring in Europe as well. But at times, there's always been an effort by some to restore or completely change the world order. That is, to base it again on a new Rome, if you will, a new hegemon. And this is why this is what was to some extent the effort by be it Napoleon, Adolf Hitler, but also this has been what the United States had an opportunity to pursue after the Cold War, because there was only one center of power left. That's when the Americans began to pursue what's referred to as Pax Americana, which is an effort to replicate this great 200 period of history of the Roman Empire, in which there's only one hegemon. We often refer to this Pax Americana under a liberal international order, because we say if there's one center of power, there won't be any competition. In other words, the international anarchy has been mitigated, And also the US will then elevate the role of liberal democratic values. And this is why we often refer to it as a liberal international order. What we often see is hegemony and liberalism. They don't really go hand in hand. It's a bit like empire and liberalism, which is also what we're seeing now. One will consume the other. So it's I would say the liberal international order is based on some good ideas, but I think it neglects the element of power, and this is why it's also crumbling.
I'm not a big fan of Henry Kissinger. For me, he was a war criminal, but he wrote a book on world order, and he introduced, in my opinion, as one of the first, this concept of balance of power. Do you refer to this concept of balance of power?
Yeah, this is a key element of the Westphalian world order. That is, if there's not one hegemon, one state, a new Holy Rome, if you will, who dominates the regional or international system, how do you then have order? What is order based upon? And then the solution is, well, you have a balance of power. You have many centers of power, many states, and among the great powers, if one begins to expand, pursuing hegemonic ambitions, then the rest of the international system will seek to balance it, so contain it. And so this tends to be how we often explain movements in the international system. So, and this is also what political realism is largely based upon. So if you want to look through history, for example, if you have World War II, you have the Germany rising. What would be the interest of Soviet Union, United States? It would be to balance the power rising. So they would then cooperate against the rising power. Once Germany is knocked out, then you have these two big powers. How would they organize? Well, they would then begin to mobilize against each other, recruit as much as of the international system to go behind them as possible. Then you have effectively the Cold War. And once the Soviets imploded or collapsed, there's one hegemon only. Now, the problem with a unipolar system is a balance of power. The international system naturally returns to an equilibrium, to a balance of power, because as we discussed in the 90s, what happens when you have one center of power? Well, this state isn't going to constrain itself, is it? So it's going to pursue expansionist policies in terms of, what you've seen, the invasion of Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. So NATO expansion, all of these efforts, which begins to drain away at the resources, but also it will instigate other great powers, be China, Russia, Brazil, Iran, all these countries who might not have a lot in common, India, but they would like to contain or balance the dominant state, which is the US. Even to some extent, the EU is also a bit of a balancing project, soft balancing, but the whole idea of having a common currency, the European Union is a trade bloc, is to have collective bargaining power vis-a-vis the United States, so more autonomy for the Europeans. So this is how the system naturally pursues or returns to an equilibrium. Also, once you have a unipolar system, one dominant state, not only will it expand, but it will also reject the principle of sovereign equality. Because why should it allow other states to have the same sovereignty? Of course it wouldn't. This is where the invention of the rules-based international order comes, where effectively the US and its partners can more or less make up new rules in which they preserve their sovereignty but deny it to others.
So with the emerging new powers, especially India and China, we can observe also a fear in Western media, in also Western liberal academics. And I have to admit that I see this paradox. There is this narrative of, okay, the good guys versus the bad guys, the democracies against the authoritarian regimes. But there is a paradox in there because, for example, if we observe, for example, that democracies are, for example, in the case of the United States, an empire. So how could an empire be a democracy? So it is peaceful, maybe inside, because it's a democracy, it has liberal rights, human rights, etc. But on the outside, it is aggressive, it is imperialistic, and so on and so forth. It fought many illegal wars, especially Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So but on the other hand, we can observe that there is, for example, China, which is not very democratic. And also there are human rights abuses, especially when we observe the Uyghurs, the minorities, the Muslims, and so on and so forth. So, but on the other hand, China didn't fought a war in the last few decades. So isn't it a paradox or how to understand it? Because many are now fearful of, okay, now China is emerging and a new global power. Would it be imperialistic as the United States, for example? What is your take on this paradox? Is it a paradox, or did I observe it wrong?
No, it's an interesting dynamic, at least, because also there's many who have been reporting on it for a while. Towards the end of during the Second World War, there's a German, Jewish scholar. He later went to the U.S. His name is John Hertz, and he wrote about how liberals or liberal democracies tend to favor their own dominance of international institutions. And the paradox you're referring to is he argued that the more democratic or liberal democratic a state is domestically, the more it will demand an international system where it dominates empire, if you will. And the reason he gave is because the liberal democracies will want to defend their values from the majority. So simply put, China, for example, it shouldn't have the same representation in the international system because they don't have the same good values. That's the idea. So this creates this paradox, if you will, in which liberal democracies can have proper representation internally, but when it comes to international institutions, they often prefer to have to not have democracy, so essentially rule them. Now, one can argue that there's some benign intentions, that they envision essentially an internationally aristocratic institution, that is international institution dominated by the West, but for the benefit of all, because we care more about democracy, human rights, supposedly. But realistically, in order to preserve this dominant position, we have to serve our own interests. So that aristocracy devolves into a oligarchy. So it becomes an international system where we dominate in order to preserve our own dominance. And this is why you see that the power politics and the values they pretend to, or at least have the ambition to serve, they no longer harmonize, because, and you can see this in Middle East, we're happy to pursue genocide if it's needed. In Ukraine, we had many opportunities to embrace peaceful solutions, which we committed to. We then sabotaged all of them, and now, as we see in the EU, we even punish states who attempt to pursue diplomacy. So there's the contradictions emerge, and I think this is why it can be helpful to look at the aristocratic versus the oligarchic model. So our attention is our leadership for the benefit of all, but then we end up our leadership, which is main purpose of simply sustaining that leadership. And this is the problem of liberal hegemony, if you will. That is, we link we can have good values worth protecting, liberal ideals, but we link it to the dominance of one entity of power. So we have to then keep the other's powers weaker. And I often, as I make the argument in my book, this is not something new. If you look back at the 19th century, the British pursued liberal imperialism, and many liberals, be it John Stuart Mill and many others, they argued empire was good for liberalism. This is by dominating the international system. This is how the British were able to spread liberalism around the system. Other liberals, of course, argued, no, this contradicts. If you want liberalism, you have to respect the self-governance of other states, and you have to reject some of the tools of imperialism. But then liberal imperialism was very much embraced by liberals, even though it's contradiction. And today's version of that is liberal hegemony, but it's still the same format of liberal imperialism. And you have also there some liberals supporting the idea that empire can be used to spread liberalism, others reject it. So there are splits within the liberal groups. But paradox, I would agree. In terms of China, China and Russia, by the way, they often talk about democratizing the international system. And this is something in the West we reject, because we say that would dilute the values, because we have, and it's not that unfair what the argument coming out of the West, because why would a liberal democracy have the same representation as North Korea, for example, which doesn't represent its people at all? So it's not as if it's completely unreasonable, but these are some of the dilemmas. China, I think it's very much embraced multipolarity. This is why it doesn't prevent, for example, Russia from diversifying its economic connectivity. If they wanted dominance, they would prevent Russia from integrating economically with India, for example. They don't at all. And furthermore, they pursue not an ideology, but ideas at least. They're spreading the ideas that it's not a good idea. Well, it's good to have civilizational diversity. So they're rejecting universalist principles. Now, this should be seen as a good sign, because if you reject universalism, that means you will not claim the right to rule over other peoples. So, for example, if you say human rights or democracy is universal, then we have the right to interfere into the sovereignty of other states. China rejects all universalism because they say, well, Xi Jinping made the point that not unlike Harari, by the way, arguing that you need a diversity of civilization in order to have peace. So this could, of course, change once China becomes the leading or dominant state. It might begin to act more as a hegemon. So it's not. It's worth keeping one's eyes open and not be naive. But to date, I would say they very much embraced multipolarity. So that should be seen as a positive aspect.
I couldn't remember the name of the historian. It was a scholar who wrote a book, and his thesis is that in the history we observe that when a power is emerging and is claiming hegemony, there is always a war. And he explained that in the sequence of in this fight for hegemony, there is always war. So are we heading...
Thucydides' trap, yeah, this has become very popular.
True, yeah. So are we heading towards this trap, or is the risk of a World War III, for example, is it realistic, or what is your take on that?
Well, I think what can mitigate it is exactly that this is not the Cold War, where it's either if one side will win, it's either American or Soviet hegemon. I think we've seen the last global hegemon, which is the United States. After this, I don't think there's possibilities for China to actually become that dominant. Because if they will start to attempt to impose hegemony or reduce effectively the ability of its partners to act as sovereign states, I think much of the foundation would disappear. This is part of the well, let's look at Russia, for example. When they diversify their economic connectivity, they link themselves closer to Japan, Korea, Iran, India. Now, and part of the reason why there's an interest of China to respect, for example, Russian security interests in an economic interest in Central Asia, if they begin to try to cut Russia off Central Asia to dominate that region, the Russians will be much less comfortable with relying on Chinese technologies, industries, transportation corridors, financial systems, currencies, and across the boards. So what would they do? They would begin then to diversify away a bit from China and lean more towards India. So an equilibrium would naturally restore itself if China began to try to convert its economic leadership into political dominance. So far it looks as if China is acting responsibly in that way. But I think World War is very possible. But this is why I'm also concerned that this is mostly coming from our side. So for example, if we go to the Ukraine war, it has to be pointed out that all of these possibilities of having peaceful solutions in Ukraine, which was rejected one after the other, it always came from our side. Keep in mind that back in 2013, the Ukrainians suggested, listen, let's have Russia, Ukraine, EU agreement, so we don't have to choose. We said no. And then, of course, we helped toppling the government. And then And then we had the Minsk agreement. We said, okay, we'll do this agreement, but in reality, as Merkel and Hollande said, they were just sending weapons to buy time to build up Ukraine. So we didn't take that peace opportunity either. And how many times did the Russian try to push for having a common European security architecture? We ignored those for 25 years. Also in 2021, the Russians proposed, listen, if you're going to try to push it further into Ukraine, we need some security guarantees, which were not unreasonable. Certainly, if Russia was trying to establish itself militarily in Mexico, it would be reasonable to give the United States some security guarantees, you would think. But we rejected this as well, even though, as Stoltenberg and Americans recognized, that war would be the repercussion. So then the Russians invade, try to impose peace on the first day after the war. Again, the US and the UK rejects the peace. They say instead to Zelensky, reject peace and we'll give you all the weapons you need if you choose to fight instead. And even now, 2.5 years into it, most people are now recognizing we're losing this proxy war in Ukraine. And nonetheless, none of us wants to even start diplomacy with the Russians. When Hungary did so, they're being punished by the European Union. It's quite extreme, and the incoming, well, the outgoing foreign policy chief of the EU said that the war has to be resolved on the battlefield. The incoming foreign policy chief says that we can't have diplomacy with Russia because Putin is a war criminal, and we do not talk to war criminals. So this is diplomacy in the European Union. Also, she defined victory to some extent as breaking up Russia into smaller countries. So you have to see why there's a rejection of peace all the time. And I think this also go back to this liberal ideals, which is again, liberalism, many great ideas, that's not the point, but we tend to view ourselves and others in terms of ideological identities. So and if you're fighting evil, a new Hitler, as we keep calling Putin, you can't do compromise, you can't negotiate. Again, this is appeasement, and instead peace will arrive when we defeat them. And this is not just Russia. We do this towards Iran, China. There's no compromise to be made because good should not compromise with evil. So there's good values should not compromise with bad values. So this is a very dangerous path we put ourselves on.
Absolutely. In many interviews, you talked about this problem with incrementalism. So we started with sending helmets, we started with humanitarian aid, then we sent anti-tank weapons, then missiles, then slowly but surely infrastructure, intelligence of all sorts. And now we are we are sending F-16s, fighter jets. So slowly but surely we see that the red line was drawn here, but a few weeks or few months afterwards, the red line was drawn differently. So we can skip this topic because you talked many times in many podcasts about it, so people can watch it. But we can observe this, that the red line is always pushing away. So
the last step now. Now, of course, with the invasion of Kursk, the Ukrainians are using NATO military, not just the weapons, but it also seems very clear to me, at least, that they're operating some of the missiles now based on the American intelligence and the cooperation with NATO. So we are now participating in the invasion of Russia. We now have European and American tanks again rolling into Russia and killing civilians there. So it's another kind of red line we step across. And again, the logic is, well, is Russia going to retaliate? But if they retaliate, there's a possibility of escalating into world war. But if they don't retaliate, what is our conclusion every time? Oh, Russia doesn't defend its own red lines. We can do another step. Why not bomb Moscow? Indeed, the Americans don't want to even rule out that the Ukrainians should be allowed to use American missiles to bomb Moscow. So there's this. You can only go so far up the escalation ladder before, even though the Russians don't want to do it because it might trigger World War III, they will feel compelled to respond at the end. So I agree. This it's is a definition of is something that NATO has done in all aspects in terms of its enlargement policies, missile defense, and of course in this war, it's always pursuing an incrementalism, and it has purpose because if you do everything at once, you will have a lot of opposition at home, and it will spark a fierce reaction. Imagine the beginning of the war when the Germans only want to send helmet, and instead they're sending tanks and missiles and calling for invasion of Russia. This would have led to a world war. But instead, this is drip, drip, slow incrementalism. Again, same with missile defense. Deliberately, the Americans said, let's, Rumsfeld said, let's just put 10 interceptor missiles. What lunatic would oppose this? None of the Europeans could seriously oppose it because 10 is not a threat. But then you gradually increase it to like tens, hundreds, and there's no logical cutoff when people should protest. And once the Russians eventually respond, we can say, whoa, this was unprovoked. It was disproportionate, and we can, but the problem is we delude ourselves as well, and we slow walk into these conflicts, and one day the other side will push back, and we're here where we are now, a big war where we assume we had nothing to do with it.
Absolutely. And Colonel Markus Reisner, I'm following every video and interview of his, and he once stated a very interesting thing, that we are falling into our own propaganda. This was quite astonishing to say it on TV, in a German outlet, I believe. What was it? ZDF, I believe. But this narrative, this was an exception, but the narrative is that Putin might be bluffing. So this is all a huge bluff, and he will not use strategic or tactical nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. So this is the current narrative, I believe. But let me jump to another interesting thing. You said in many interviews also that this narrative, and we know it from the peace studies, this is the way propaganda functions. You have to portray yourself as the good guy. The war that you are starting is always for the right causes, and you are always defending yourself, and the opponent is aggressive, and so on and so forth. But the Spanish philosopher Raúl Sánchez Quedelo wrote a wonderful book which was translated from Spanish into German. And in his he dedicated I believe a chapter on this, and he said this with this term reductio ad Hitlerum, which he wanted to describe this narrative that we are constructing in the West, that Putin is Hitler, and everything is reduced to this concept of, okay, we are dealing with Hitler, so there is no point of dealing with him, of making agreements with him and talking to him, and there could be no peace agreements and negotiations with Hitler. Of course, yeah, this is absurd, and yeah. But you also stated that this comparison is a false one, and it's dangerous, because
sorry.
Because we cannot grasp peace if we have the absolute evil and yeah, a demon or Darth Vader, then we cannot make peace. This is clear for everybody.
But look at the people we called Hitler through only the last 30 years. You know, Slobodan Milosevic, he was Hitler. Saddam Hussein was referred as Hitler. In Iran, they're Hitler. Gaddafi is Hitler. Xi Jinping is Hitler. Like there's a tendency to always portray our adversaries as Hitler, and of course it's strengthened this propaganda, as you say. This is very instinctive in human nature. We always, it's one of our most primitive instincts. We divide, we're social animal. We divide into groups, us versus them. And propaganda effectively uses this because group psychology is very different from the rationality of the individual. Most of the irrational things we do also comes from this group psychology. And if you can portray us as being driven only by benign intentions, so we want to help Ukraine, we want to defend democracy, all of this, there's no evidence for it, but it's a good identity, if you will. And then if the adversary is Hitler, well, what did we learn from Hitler? Well, when we made a compromise with him, it was appeasement. It actually made the situation worse. So you can't make peace. And instead, peace came when finally defeating him. And so this is why it's an attractive thing to sell to the rest of the international system. But as you said, it's very dangerous because we end up buying and believing our own propaganda. And I think this can also be explained by all our failed military adventurism. Because imagine if you explain politics to a little child or a child, they would say, oh, over there is a bad man. The reason we have conflict is a bad man. If we can just get rid of the bad man, then peace will be restored. This is for fanatics and children, but this is what we're actually pursuing, which is great concern, because if we're believing our own nonsense, what do? We go out in the world, we do all this regime change through war or coups, and then it blows up in our face, and we're not able to put together a political solution because we misdiagnosed the problem to begin with. It wasn't because it was a bad man. It was the national interest or security interest of that state was very different from ours. We never addressed this. Instead, we just remove the man, and then we say chaos which ensues. Either they won't pursue their own national interests, security interests, and the state will begin to implode, or some radical forces might take over. But anyways, we always end up with the same situation. We can topple governments, but then we leave a chaos behind which we can't manage. So that's also a concern of mine, that we not only present this good versus evil in which we make a criminalized diplomacy and make war the only option, but we also see that we actually buy into this, and we then can't actually address the core of the problem. And this is why I go back to what we started saying. Well, have you ever read in a paper what are the legitimate security concerns of Iran, of China, of Russia? These are large countries. They have security concerns. Their policy are not. We go almost with assumption. Oh, well, they're just evil. They just want to exterminate someone. They're anti-Semites or hate democracy, so even trying to understand them is immoral. We should just condemn. Which is why whenever we talk about Middle East, Russia, they always start, for example, interviews on TV. Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Putin? Like, this is your conclusion. You don't start at that end, but that's what we do, and it's very dangerous.
Absolutely. In the book Critical Peace Studies, which was published this year in German, kritische Friedensforschung, Werner Wintersteiner wrote also an article on complex-oriented peace, and he was referring to the concept written or established by Edgar Morin, a French philosopher, who wrote a wonderful and thin book on the Ukraine crisis. And he was also saying that we need this complex-oriented thinking, and even with contradiction, and it is full of contradiction. Yes, Putin and China and the systems are autocratic, and the lack of maybe in some ways of human rights and so on. But in the same way, we need to understand that our democracies are also imperialistic and made wars that are against international law. So what we said in the beginning with this paradox. So contradictions are there, and we have to understand it. And the sooner we understand it, the earlier we can start negotiations, and maybe this is the starting point of even changing their systems and making them more democratic, but not by war. I never heard of a country that was bombed into democracy. So maybe I'm wrong, but
well, again, if you look at the peace studies, which you're referring to, which became very big in the early 90s, studies effectively not just how to prevent war, but what produces peace. A lot of it was quite optimistic, but what many people also recognized is liberalism comes with two legacies. One is the pursuit of good governance, which would then be inclined towards pursuing peaceful solutions. But the second is that of imperialism, and many would look to the Reagan administration. He firmly believed we should promote democracy, freedom around the world, because it will lead to more stability. But also this went hand in hand with empire building. So this is not a controversial argument to make, which is why the complexity have to be embraced and recognized. Instead, we have this mindless propaganda which dumbs down everything, in which, well, you have to pick A or B, which side you support. And if you don't support the right side, then you're met with slogans. So, and the core of international, in the international system, what is the main source of conflict is the security competition. All states compete for security, right? And this is what happens under an international anarchy, because you don't have a world police, if you will. Now, under security competition, what do you want to do? Well, you want to deter the adversary so they don't attack you, but you don't want to provoke them either. So yeah, you want to deter China or you want to deter Russia, but if you line up NATO missiles across its borders, you provoke it into responding because they can't live under such circumstances. You know, if you want a case study, you should look at my country in Norway. Throughout the whole Cold War, we based our policies on this. We wanted deterrence without provocation. So we joined NATO so the Soviets would be deterred, but we didn't want any foreign troops or too much activity in the high north because we didn't want to provoke the Soviets. This was sensible. This made sense in the absence of at least a common inclusive security architecture. This was as good as it got. These days, I would say we were led like mostly by fanatics. They don't recognize any security competition. It's all deterrence because the adversary only have belligerent intentions. We don't recognize or even discuss their security concerns. So why would we take them into account? And we do now going to open bases, American bases across our country. There's much more activity in the high north. We don't seem to mind being America's front line against the Russians in the Arctic. There's no discussion, anything. Nothing we do can possibly be provocative because we're liberal democracies. We just want peace, stability, human rights. It's the Russians who are evil and want to restore a Soviet Union. So everything is deterrence. Nothing is attempting to reduce provocations. So and this is the patriotic thing to do. If you don't do it, you're a Putinist, you're a Putin-versteher. But this is for our own interest. You don't want to provoke the adversary because then they will have to respond and we will become the next Ukraine. So but there's no common sense in this regard anymore. Because if you can't discuss the security interest of your opponent, how can you possibly avoid provocations? So this propaganda comes at a very heavy cost.
Absolutely. You said about liberalism, and what came to my mind was this Marxist thinker, Italian Marxist thinker, Domenico Losurdo, who wrote a wonderful book, Liberalism, A Counter History. And there he argues that the liberal tradition has often excused and even celebrated slavery, racism, exploitation, even genocide, when we see many and other atrocities. For example, the chattel slavery in the United States, the Opium Wars, the North, what was it? The East Indian Company, with all its imperialistic ambitions and so on and so forth. So he reconstructed the whole idea and ideology, and it's a wonderful book coming from Marxist lens. So it's worth reading. This I wanted to add.
That's a good way of understanding the current politics as well, because how do we organize the international system today? We say everything is liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. This is how we dumb down any question. But it's also good to manipulate the public, because if there's suddenly a war in Ukraine, someone in America never knew it existed or never seen it on a map, but they already know what their opinions should be, because, oh, it's liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Okay, well, we know exactly what our opinions should be. So it's a good way of mobilizing the public, but it's also very propagandistic. Now, my point is we had this format, as you suggested, back in the back through history, not just the 19th century, but then we divided the world into civilized states versus barbarians. And again, you can say, oh, so civilization is good. You spread the rule of law, but it can come with good values. Obviously, civilization is a good thing. But what it implies is sovereign inequality. That means the civilized, obviously, they should have sovereignty. These barbarians, as they explicitly said, they don't have any claim for sovereignty. They are, they're barbarians. So suddenly it legitimizes slavery, exploitation, and war, and a lot of destruction. And this was part of the problem. what is different today? When we say liberal democracy and authoritarianism, what do we really say? We're all saying sovereign inequality. We should obviously have sovereignty. No one should interfere in our elections, but other countries, well, they're the modern barbarians. Why should they have proper sovereignty? We can interfere in their elections. We have benign intentions. We can topple their governments. We can invade them. We can take part of their territory away. So there's no real rulers anymore. And this is the principle of sovereign inequality, which is why also I compare in my book with George Orwell's Animal Farm, where it says, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Yeah, this is what we say about states. All states are equal in terms of sovereignty, but some should be more equal than others. What was interesting is 2-3 weeks ago, when discussing the rules-based international order, Sergei Lavrov used the same analogy. He referred to Orwell's Animal Farm, so I thought that was excellent. But that just want to point out I came with it first. So.
So what you are referring to is ideology. So the value or rule-based order is full of ideology. Some part is good, as we said, civilization, rules, international law, human rights, especially democracy. We are born and raised and studied. We are Western scholars, so we of course we stand for democracy. So of course we see value in it. So this is undoubtable. But here comes the tricky part. You cannot be against democracy. You cannot be against human rights. You cannot be against life per se, and so on and so forth. So this is the tricky part. And ideology makes us a fool. Because it tricks us into believing that if you are not for A, you are for B, and this is the tricky part. So let's talk about the international law and rules. For example, in the case of Israel, for example, and South Africa alleged that Israel had committed genocide against Palestinians. South Africa also referred to the history of apartheid, and of course they know what apartheid is because they lived under apartheid for several years, and they described Israel as an apartheid state. In April this year, Iran stated that Israel bombed its embassy in Syria. So this attack on a diplomatic and consular premises violates, of course, the UN Charter, as well as the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. So it violates heavily the international law. A few days or weeks ago, we saw the killing of a Hamas leader in Iran, which can also be interpreted as an act of war. And here, of course, we cannot ask the question, does Iran has the right to self-defend itself? Of course, this is not a legitimate question for Western academics, so I will not ask you this question. But having said all that, how do you think is and of course we can say about the Iraq invasion, the illegal Kosovo, we can go on and on and on. I believe I made the point very clear. What do you think is the global South thinking of us? What do you think? The foreign minister of India once, I believe this year, came to Vienna, and in the state-sponsored media ORF, he totally contradicts the narrative of the Austrian Armin Wolf, who asked him, why do you not condemn Russia for the illegal invasion of Ukraine? And then he said, if I condemn every US or Western aggression, then there will be a long silence or a long pause. So he debunked this. And what do you think? What is the global South thinking of us and this ideology and these tricks that we are playing?
Well, I'm glad you used the word trick, because it is a trick, and this is why we also ask always the question, do you condemn because then you have to say this implies which is a good guy or a bad guy. I often replied, yeah, sure, I condemn Russia's invasion, but like the Indians, I also condemn America's invasion of Iraq. I condemn NATO's invasion of Libya and condemn NATO's toppling of the Ukrainian government and building it up as a proxy. So many things I can condemn, but then it's usually pushed back. How dare you can't compare this. But again, this is the whole purpose. Nothing should be able to be compared, and this is because you're asked to essentially point out to who is the aggressor, who is the evil, who's the good guy and bad guy. And this goes back to what you said also, which is the idea you have to be for or against something. There's a Chinese philosopher, he was Sun Tzu. He was who about 1300 years ago argued that if you want the truth before you, you should never be for or against. This is the worst poison for the mind, because for or against, good or evil. And this is the only language we have now. There's no complexity, there's no nuance. It's always which is good, which is bad. Or in our language, do you condemn? Do you not condemn? And I think this is why much of the global South also, I think, frankly, that we've begun to lost our mind a bit, because they're not buying into this narrative either, that there's no possible, first of all, that we were not involved in this war, that this is also a NATO war. We helped to provoke it. We undermined all possible avenues to peace, and then we continue to escalate. So. And also, I think they know why we want to condemn Russia. This is because they would like to defeat Russia. This is the absurdity. Even when the French Macron went to China, is calling for China to help to end the war. And the Chinese, of course, they're very keen. They don't want this war. They want it to end. So sure. But the Europeans, they don't even want to talk to Russia. So exactly how is China supposed to help to end the war? Well, as Macron says, well, cut all economic ties, stop putting pressure on them. So you're not looking for peace, you're looking to defeat them. You want capitulation, you want to break Russia. And also that's absurd, by the way, because the Americans keep saying very openly that part of the purpose of this war against Russia in Ukraine is to break Russia, to defeat them, so they can then focus on China instead. So it's, they say this in the open, and yet they expect the Chinese to assist them in this endeavor. So no, I think the global South, they don't care for a lot of these what do you call them, these double standards. They don't buy into the narrative. They don't see the world being good versus evil, of being liberal democracies versus authoritarian states. And also, the whole point of liberal democracy in international affairs is that the idea of from Kant's perpetual peace or democratic peace theory is that the liberal democracies would be more favorable of having security institutions which seeks peaceful solution to conflict and not weapons and not wars. But who's doing most of the wars these days? Who's invaded most countries? Who's doing the forever wars? It's us. It's our liberal imperial wars. So we often dismiss the global South. They don't have enough values, or they fall for Russian propaganda. But no one asks if we're the one who have been victim of war propaganda. So, and lastly, beyond the hypocrisy, I think there's also recognition in terms of what my book was about as well, which is that this war is about world order, and knocking out Russia is an effort to restore unipolarity or hegemony. And they don't want this. They made it very clear that they don't want for hegemony to be restored. They want multipolarity, and this. I often cite this because it's a wonderful interview with a Singaporean diplomat. I forgot his name. He was the former president of the UN Security Council, Mahubati. I'm not going to slaughter his name. Anyways, his main point was that the international system is, and no one in the global South want to see Russia defeated, because imagine the hubris coming out of the West, the arrogance, the victory lap we would do. And again, for us, the 90s was a golden era, but for the rest of the world, this was, we became a little bit intolerable, because all decisions in the world should be made by us. When we walk around the world, we should teach, the simple countries how to live. So they don't want this. They want a multipolar system, and if we destroy Russia, they're not going to get this. And this is why they don't want the defeat of Russia. But of course, this is very different than condoning the invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is a healthy position to take. They don't support invading another sovereign country, irrespective of provocations. But they don't want to see the West destruction of Russia. And we have to be honest with ourselves. That is the goal. Anyone, if you would advise Putin today, if you can make him implement any policy, what would you really recommend? How can he create peace now? We closed all avenues to peace. You can say, oh, get out of Ukraine, but that's not the end of the war, because NATO already expressed its intention. It's going to move into Ukraine then. It's going to go into Crimea. And from there on, we have very clear objectives that we're going to try to weaken Russia severely. I mean, America is not a human rights organization. It's not Amnesty International with nuclear weapons. They do have an objective. They stated it clearly. They have an international system based on hegemony. Then you have to break the rising power with this, which is Russia. Disconnect its economic ties with others and break it. They've said what they're going to do. So the war would not end if Russia leaves Ukraine. We need an agreement, restore neutrality, end NATO's incursion on Russian borders. But we won't even talk with the Russians. So what exactly can Russia do today to create peace? I don't see any good proposals coming anymore, because we closed off all possible pathways.
Absolutely. Talking about Ukraine, Susan Watkins wrote a wonderful article, 5 Wars in One, in the New Left Review. I recommend it for reading. It's it's a wonderful book. It shows that there is ethnic crisis, there is civil war, there is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but also there is a geopolitical war. And so there are many dimensions, and it is complex. And because we talked about narratives, because we said, okay, this is a trick, so we have the responsibility to deconstruct these tricks and to show the arguments of every side, and this is very important. I can observe, in regard of the Ukraine crisis, I can observe that we talked about the good versus bad, the authoritarian versus the democratic systems, but there is key points. For example, for one side, the Maidan was a democratic revolution. For the other, it was a massacre. Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, for example, from Canada, he made wonderful research on that, and the involvement of the government on massacring people. So on one hand, we can criticize this narrative that it was all wonderful. Of course, there were oligarchs. Of course, people wanted to be democratic, and of course, many, especially in the western part, wanted to join the EU. This is undoubtable. But to call it a democratic revolution is it's absurd. And we heard this phrase over and over again, like a mantra, that the war was unprovoked. In my opinion, Professor Werner Wintersteiner put it correctly. The West started the conflict, but Russia started the war. So we have to differentiate. And the critical peace studies, scholars from the critical peace studies, they differentiate these two: conflict and war. Of course, Russia started the war. Of course, the war is illegal and brutal, and like every war, it is to be condemned. But on the other hand, we need to analyze the key roots of this conflict. NATO expansion on one hand, EU association agreements, and so on, Eurasian integration, this competition of okay, who will have access to resources in Ukraine, talking about lithium, talking about many other resources, and so on and so forth, talking about the CIA bases prior to 2014, I believe. It was published in the New York Times, I believe. To say it was unprovoked is too short. And to focus, for example, only on the 7th of October in regard of the Gaza crisis is also too short. And to see what happens in the February when Russia started the war is also too short. So history didn't begin on February when Russia started the war. So there was a pretext, and by making us blind, or by Slavoj Žižek once said on the Frankfurter book fair that there is a cancellation of theory, of making theory. They forbid us to make theory, to think, in other words, to think critically, and then to grasp the whole context. And my last point was value versus interests. So we have this Maidan revolution versus massacre, we have this unprovokedness, and then we have value versus interests. So we portray ourselves as Ukraine is fighting for Western civilization and democracy and for freedom. And on the other hand, but BlackRock and other companies and political elites and economic elites have their interests, and there is now a debt crisis going on in Ukraine. So these 3 points I wanted to open shortly. So do you agree with my analysis so far, and would you add something maybe?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think part of the problem is that we instead of having this critical analysis and open discussion, we shut it down. And I see that everywhere. Whenever we try to explain Russia's position, I'm told, well, you're legitimizing it, because if you explain what they're doing and their legitimate security concerns, then you're legitimizing the reaction. So, but by doing this kind of narrowing the scope of acceptable discourse, it's a way of faking the freedom of speech and debate. You just narrow it and then have debate within very confined frames. But this is also what we did with the coup in Ukraine, because again, we call it a democratic revolution. If you call it a coup, the European Union has its own fact checkers who will say this is Russian propaganda. The correct is democratic revolution, but this is not a fact. This is a narrative. So you have fact checkers checking narratives. Facts would mean you can say what would be a democratic revolution. Well, would it be consistent with the constitution? Well, no, it violated the Ukrainian constitution. Did they have an elected government? Yeah, the Yanukovych, which they removed, was a democratically elected government. Did at least the majority of Ukrainians support the coup? No, they did not. This is also recognized. So one can then ask, what exactly makes it a democratic revolution if it fails on all of these facts? But we don't discuss this, and if you do, you're a Putinist. And the same goes with this unprovoked. And I like the context you put it in. Is it a difference between a conflict and a war? Of course, one would have to define when a conflict turns into a war. Usually wars are defined by the amount of casualties, but at least in academic circles. But you're right, because on the what the New York Times article revealed was that just before that, we already learned that the Americans, when they toppled the government in Ukraine, they had picked out the new government which should come in. So the New York Times article referred to after the coup, or actually on the same day as the coup, you had the new intelligence chief of Ukraine walking in, and it's safe to assume that the Americans handpicked him. And the New York Times pointed out that on the first day he walked into the building, the first thing he did was to call CIA and MI6 and start a covert war against Russia. This was before the Russians then took back Crimea or anything else. So this even led to the deaths of Russians. They set up this 12 CIA military base along the border. All of this has been established. Now, is this a conflict then, or is it a war? The problem is it depends on who defines it. If the Chinese would do this in Mexico, topple the governments, then the day after send in its intelligence agencies to put up borders, the secret intelligence bases along the American borders, do incursion into American territory, steal technology, kill Americans, the Americans would probably call it a war. We're reluctant to do so because everything is narrative driven now, and we don't want to legitimize the opponent. So, but nonetheless, if you refer to war more in the conventional open warfare, yeah, of course you can argue that. But also, when the people in Donbass didn't want to recognize the legitimacy of the new government, the West backed the government installed in Ukraine to launch an anti-terrorist operation, which killed thousands of Ukrainians. You can argue this is a civil war, not an interstate war. So I think it can be helpful to define these concepts and put them into a context now, my whole argument is that what NATO did, it was such a provocation, and this, as we talked about, this incrementalism, salami tactics, just escalating, and then the Russians went in militarily. And I think calling it unprovoked was false. You can call it the start of the actual war, because before then Russia it interfered in Donbass, but covertly. It was not an overt war. So I think that is it's quite useful. But also a key narrative has been this idea that you can't talk to Putin and you can't negotiate with him. And this is where the propaganda in the West goes really off the rails, because this demands we ignore what's happened in the first week of the Russian invasion. And this is on the Ukrainian government's own website. They show that on the day after Russia invaded, Zelensky confirmed the Russians contacted them to discuss neutrality. Everyone confirms that the Russians and Ukrainians were close to a deal, and it does, and that the main thing that the Russians wanted was to restore neutrality. But because our war narrative is that Russia wants to rebuild an empire, we can't include this into our war narrative. So we just put it in the memory hole. No one discuss it. Whoever brings it up again is a Putinist. So I think the main problem is, as we began to talk, was you said liberalism and empire doesn't go hand in hand, and I think that's where we are now. And our ability to dress up empire in the clothes of good liberal intentions is disappearing. And yeah, because as a last note, look at China. In the past, the Americans put sanctions on them because they said, oh, human rights or something. But now, listen to the think tanks, listen to the politicians, what they're saying. They're openly saying that how can we compete with the Chinese is nearly impossible. We have to try to break them. So no one really seriously thinks that the efforts to crush Chinese chip manufacturing, for example, has anything to do with human rights. It is about economic competition. The Americans can't compete, so they're doing whatever they can to break Chinese industries. So the whole, I guess, liberal veil or mask has been very much taken off, because they're speaking very openly about this is what American leadership depends on, which is breaking China, and Russia is the equivalent in Europe, at least. So we dug a big hole for ourselves, I think, and this is definitely the collapse of world order, which is hegemony, and we're losing a lot of our values at the same go.
For just a few remarks, and then we come to the end. Adam Tooze, a professor of economics in one of a elite uni. I'm not sure if it was Columbia or anyways, he said openly in a German podcast, that he observed that the only way to stop the economic growth of China is to make this economic war and the sanctions and yes, sabotage basically many Chinese firms and the economy. But going back to the Ukraine crisis, Naftali Bennett, a key diplomat, Israeli diplomat, he stated in the BBC, I believe, that it was the UK and Johnson who stopped the negotiations, and it was him that I believe that, and with him it started this theory that the UK and the US intervened, I believe. So yeah, he is a serious source, so one can believe it.
Yeah, well, it was a two-track. It was both the Israelis and the Turks who were negotiating, who were mediating. And what's interesting is not only the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett confirmed that they were close to a deal, but then the Americans, well, represented by Boris Johnson on the British side, sabotaged it. But he also explicitly said that this was because they saw an opportunity to weaken Russia, so effectively fight Russia with Ukrainians. Now, interestingly, on the Turkish side, as the second mediator, they said the exact same thing. If you listen to the interview of the Turkish foreign minister, he also said the same thing. The Americans and British saw an opportunity to kill the Russians and weaken a strategic rival using using Ukrainians, so why wouldn't you? Yeah, it's been the fascinating one is a German actually, Harald Kujat. I think he's interesting because he was the chief of the
NATO ex NATO officer, yeah.
Yeah, head of the chairman of the NATO military committee as well. This is the top dog, if you will. This is the big guy, and he also said that NATO provoked this war, and then the Americans and the British they sabotaged the peace agreements in order to kill Russians. Even on the Ukrainian side, there's a Ukrainian ambassador, Charlie. He also confirmed we were very close, he said, to a deal with the Russians. He argued Putin did everything he could to get a deal with the Ukrainians, that is in the beginning. And they did find a compromise. But then, the Americans happened, and the head of Zelensky's own political party, Arkamia or something along this line, as well as his advisor, Arostovich, they also confirmed that they were close to a deal. That deal is long gone. They can't get a deal anymore. And they've lost, as a result, so many men dead who will never come back. All this territory, it's quite horrific. And but again, this comes to no cost to the Americans, as the leaders keep saying over and over. All these top political military leaders, this is a great war. We get to weaken Russia, and we're not even losing American troops. This is proxy war. This is the whole point, and it's horrific tragedy for Europe.
Absolutely, and you in many interviews you quoted the general prosecutor of the Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, which is also a key figure who stated that after the Maidan, the US intervened in Ukraine by basically choosing the government and controlling what is going on. And another name that is important is Victoria Nuland, whose phone call was leaked, and she also said, Yatsenyuk is our man. So she basically chose who to become the next president. So so for people who want to do their homework and research, these are important names. So let me be cynical.
Said who shouldn't be in government, because Klitschko looked like he was going to get a position. Said no, Klitschko has to go out, and it just happened to everything they talked about 2 weeks before the coup. The government they were going to put in place, everything happened the way they said it, which they had planned, which is a remarkable coincidence. It's very much all out in the open. But again, the whole purpose of political propaganda is to trigger these instincts based on a group psychology. That is, you're loyal to the in-group, it's good versus evil. This is how you manipulate. There's no rational arguments. If it would be a rational debate, we would discuss the coup. But again, we have fact checkers telling us it's not a coup. So it's very hard to have any sensible discussion at all. So
let me be cynical. Let me play devil's advocate, and let me say that the lithium in Donbass is important for our imperial mode of living. For our green transition, for our capitalist society, and Ukraine is defending our way of life. It is because we need critical infrastructure. We need to contain Russia and to stop the multipolarity, especially the growth of China and this symbiosis of China and Russia. And this is our interest, and we in the West, we are profiting from this. And you live also in the West. I'm in Austria. I'm based in Austria, so we need cheap gas and all the resources. So why shouldn't I? Even if I understand that this is cynical and this is double standard and hypocrisy, but I'm profiting from this. So. In my opinion, if politicians were honest with us and say, okay, they have them and we need them, the resources, I say. So maybe it makes, maybe I'm maybe convinced that, okay, we should go to war.
See, this is why what I like about Donald Trump is he's more honest, at least, because they all want the same things, but at least he is honest. I don't like this liberal veil or mask of imperialism. So when he says Syria, it's like, listen, I would have had their oil. I made sure we took their oil. When he said Venezuela, I was almost toppling Maduro. We would have had their oil. So at least he's speaking honestly. Doesn't mean he's less horrible, but at least he's honest. Yeah. But no, you're right. Ukraine is a huge territory. They have not just strategic ports along the Black Sea. They also have excellent agriculture, the black fertile soil, and gas, oil, but also lithium. And for the Europeans who are pursuing now this green revolution, the lithium is of abundance. And most of this is actually in the Donbass area, and thereafter it's in the what you can call the traditional Russian territory, so from Kharkov to Odessa. But really, Donbass is the real hub. And the German, I think, was economic minister, I forgot the name. Anyways, he was also in the media making a point that, well, actually, we need this if our green revolution should be successful. This should be in European hands, EU hands, not the Russians. In America, you had Lindsey Graham making the same argument. He argued that the Ukrainians were sitting effectively on a gold mine, he called it, to lithium and other resources, in which is worth about $12 trillion. He said, we can't let this end up in the hands of the Russians. This has to be effectively in our hands. We have to control it. So it is, yes, some people are speaking more frank. This is a cold, hard interest. We're competing for natural resources. And and we're not looking to help Ukraine. This is nonsense. But yeah, so your question is why shouldn't we take it? You're German, I'm Norwegian, we're Europeans, we should why not? Why shouldn't we seize these assets? And let's be a hardcore imperialists. One can make that argument, but then the feasibility has to come through as well. Now, one has to also recognize we're not winning the war in Ukraine, we're losing it. We're running out of weapons, ammunition. The Ukrainians are losing, they're running out of men. So the war has to some extent already come to an end. So we can say, well, we can try to break the Russians, with their sanctions. Yeah, sure, okay, let's set that as a goal to destroy Russia. Well, militarily, we're losing, so that doesn't work. Okay, let's destroy them economically. Well, we can put sanctions, but it turns out that the Russians, they're able to diversify their economic connectivity under this greater Eurasia initiative. They're exporting their resources to the east and hooking themselves up to their supply chain, so they can diversify away from us. But it turns out the Europeans can't diversify away from Russia. So our industries are now lacking of affordable energy to keep the industries alive. So now our industries are dying. Russia's growing. And this is the same problem with China. Of course, if America can break China and China becomes dominant, America becomes dominant for another few decades, wonderful. Let's destroy China. But as you pointed out before, what happened? Well, the Americans tried to destroy their chip industry by putting sanctions. It turns out that the Chinese have been able to develop their own chips. They're pursuing self-sufficiency and diversifying with other partners. America, on the other hand, if you see companies like Intel, which is one of the most important software producers, they lost 15,000 jobs. The biggest partner was China. I think about 26% of their business. They're even bigger than the American market. So now they're having huge economic trouble. This is dragging down the entire American tech sector, while the Chinese are doing just fine. So it's also the ability. We're not able to break the Chinese or the Russians on the battlefield or economically. So my argument is, even if this should be our goal, we have to accept reality. And the reality is we already have a multipolar international distribution of power, both in terms of military and economic power. So I think we have to adjust to this reality in order to serve our own national interests, irrespective of we're hardcore imperialists or we want more harmony in the international system. So this is just the reality. It's what we can and what we can't do. Same as in the Middle East. We can hate Hezbollah and Iran all we want. We can, be pro-genocide against the Palestinians, but this conflict is getting out of hand. We're not going to be able to contain this. And if Hezbollah launches everything it has, we're not going to be able to defeat them. Look at Yemen. We can't even stop Yemen. So let's, think a second before we go after the Iranians. You don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Well, there's not much we can do about it because they're pretty much a stepping stone stage now. If they want a nuclear weapon, they can have one. They don't want one because they don't want nuclear proliferation in the region. But if we start bombing them, they will definitely get the nuclear weapon. So what exactly is the purpose of this campaign? I'm just saying there has to be rational objectives, and they have to be achievable. I don't see we have any achievable objectives. I see we have all these weird ambitions and ideological commitments that we can't make compromise with anyone. We have to defeat them. But I don't see any ability to pursue these objectives which is set. So sorry for the long answer, but this is how I see it, at least.
Absolutely. My absolute last question, because for peace scholars and for people who love peace and are dedicated for peace, let us show possibilities or agreements or concepts that could be applied so that peace can be fruitful again, and that the Ukraine war can come to an end. For example, IBM, the International Ballistic Agreements, or the Open Sky Agreements that under Donald Trump and also under Putin, they both took it back, and of course you spoke many times about neutrality and so on and so forth. Pascal Lotatz, our joint friend from Switzerland, who is in Japan now, he has a YouTube channel that is called Neutrality Studies. So neutrality is also an important concept. So maybe we can elaborate on this. What is your take on that? What are the measures, or what are the concepts that we can apply to make peace?
Well, it should be sounds very silly or simple, but it should be the absence of war. I think the problem is, after the Cold War, we pursued the hegemonic peace. Again, as I said, Americans explicitly linked the concept of peace to the endurance of hegemony. As long as they're dominant, there won't be any wars because no one can rival them. Well, that era has ended, and I don't think we have the political imagination to envision something else. So I think we have to let go of the hegemony, because everything we're doing now, it's actually reducing security. So neutrality is an excellent example. And I met actually Pascal Lotatz, was back in 2019 in Washington, D.C. We're there for some, I think the U.S. Defense Department was co-hosting some conference. So they cared about some of neutrality. But neutrality doesn't align itself with the objective of hegemony. So look at now bringing in Sweden, Finland into NATO. What exactly has this done for security? Yes, it's good for increasing the power of NATO vis-a-vis the Russians. And it's good if you want to try to put naval containment of the Russians or something along those lines, or go for first strikes. But it's not good if we want to prevent war. And this is, you hear it in the rhetoric. Well, what does the NATO Secretary General of NATO say when Finland joined? You know, this was the biggest success story of neutrality, this huge border with Russia, been in peace since World War II, based on neutrality. What was his argument for getting rid of it? Oh, well, now look at Putin. He wanted less NATO, now he has more. You know, this is spite. It's not security. And it can be good for, power, but power should be increased to the extent it increases your security. Once it starts to undermine security, then you should stop trying to push the relative power against your adversaries. We're not doing that because we linked maximizing power with maximizing security. So same as now with the missiles. You mentioned the Americans withdrew from the INF treaty on intermediate missiles in 2019. Now they're going to deploy, I think it's in 2026, these missiles in Germany. You're going to have a 2 to 3 minutes warning the Russians if the Americans do a first strike. How on God's green earth is this going to make anyone more secure? Now the Russians.
And by the way, they struck on the anti-missile systems in Russia. 2 of them, I believe, were.
Yeah, twice. The Ukrainians attacked with drones the nuclear weapons early warning system. This has no purpose on the battlefield in Ukraine. This is to warn against a nuclear strike by the Americans. And now these missiles they're going to put in Germany. What is the point of this? Do you really want, now the Russians will have to spread out who can launch and retaliatory strike, because you don't want one guy with a button effectively, then you can have a decapitating strike. So now you need people lower down in the chain to make this decision. Also, there's been many cases of the Russians thinking they're under attack. Able Archer comes to mind. That's an important one in '83, which almost triggered nuclear war. Surely you want your opponent to have some time to consider whether or not they're actually under a nuclear attack. Unless we're planning to attack them, of course, then you want it minimal. But if you're not planning, you want to give them some breathing space before they press the button against us. So none of this, and the Russians didn't change their nuclear posture. There's no reason why we would do this. It's only to increase our relative power versus the Russians, so we can have escalatory dominance. That is, if we have conflict, we can maximize pressure. If the Russians think we can do a first strike, then they're gonna have to bow to our demands. This is not a good peace. This is one side trying to dictate to the other. We have to find some acceptable way of coexisting, because if this is what we're doing, the Russians, they're not going to capitulate. I mean, look at a Russian history book. They're not going to capitulate. They will find countermeasures, different allies. They will have incentives to mess things up in Europe. So I'm thinking this is what should be our focus. But it's not. We're seeking dominance, and this undermines our security. Again, our mind is still in the unipolar order. We need to recognize reality, that this is a multipolar system. And our security architecture and economic connectivity should reflect it if we want to serve our own national interests.
And many times you spoke about diversifying the economic dependencies and making deals with Russia and the EU at the same time and open the market for everybody. And this is also a crucial point, that you made in many interviews,
Yeah, well, this is what everyone's doing. The Turkey, India, they're not taking one side. They're saying we want to connect with all, because once you limit yourself to one partner, which is more powerful than you will have a asymmetrical interdependence, unfavorable such, and that will cost you a lot of political autonomy. Everyone is diversifying now, except the Europeans. We're cutting ourselves off China, Russia, and what's going to happen then? Or our economies will be less competitive, and also we'll be all dependent on the United States. And then we're going to be very surprised, what happened to our political autonomy? This is not going to be possible under this new economic distribution of power. So we're doing everything opposite what we're doing. We should adjust to multipolarity, which, as you said, diversify. This is the key. And we're doing the exact opposite. So Europe is becoming, it's rendering itself now less competitive and much more dependent on the United States. And this illusion that because we're allies, our interests are exactly the same, I think we're going to have a very rude awakening and realize that the United States is more pragmatic. It will look after itself. And if it can dictate terms in Europe, it will dictate terms to its own interest, not because it's bad, but this is what states tend to do.
Professor Glenn Diesen, it was an honor, and I learned a lot from you and from your books, and I appreciate it that you take your time for this interview.
Thank you so much. It was